Captain Ethan Cross had always considered himself lucky to be among the first humans to establish meaningful contact with the Zycor. He was known as one of Earth's best representatives, a natural leader with both a resilient body and an unbreakable spirit. His records showed him as a decorated officer with countless successful missions, and his adaptability in harsh environments had earned him the nickname the Phoenix among his crew. The Zycor, an advanced alien species with unmatched technological prowess, had invited Ethan to participate in an unusual experiment. Despite the formalities and somewhat diplomatic nature of his visit to their space station, he had an instinct that this wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. The Zycor were testing humanity's limits. The massive gray doors slid open with a quiet hiss as Ethan entered the control center of the Zycor research facility. Around him, various Zycor scientists, tall and thin with translucent skin that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat, moved with a calculated grace that was both intimidating and mesmerizing. Their eyes, a deep shade of emerald, regarded him with an unsettling curiosity, as if he were an exotic creature from an alien zoo. Ethan could feel the weight of their stares, but he met their gazes with a steady resolve. Dr. Ralzek, the chief Zycor scientist, approached him with an inscrutable expression. His voice was soft, but his words carried a strange resonance that echoed within the metallic walls of the chamber. Captain Cross, you are about to enter the most advanced endurance testing structure ever devised. You may feel confident in your abilities, but I must remind you this is no ordinary obstacle course, he said, his words measured and precise. Ethan offered a slight smile. With all due respect, Doctor, I've been through more dangerous things than I can count. The first'll be fine. Ralzek's face betrayed a brief hint of surprise before he regained his composure. Perhaps you misunderstand. The Deathtrap maze was not designed with your kind in mind. It is a test of ultimate survival, crafted to push beings to their absolute limits. Each section of the maze is deadly on its own. Together, they form an environment that is impossible to navigate for any known species. I like a challenge, Ethan replied, his tone unwavering. Show me where to start. Ralzek's lips tightened, and he motioned for Ethan to follow. The two of them walked down a long, sterile corridor lined with faintly humming lights embedded in the walls, casting a greenish hue over everything. At the end of the hall, a set of massive reinforced doors stood ominously, waiting to open into the unknown. We will be monitoring your progress closely, Ralzek said as they stopped in front of the doors. Every heartbeat, every breath you take will be recorded and analyzed. If you wish to exit at any point, simply stop moving for 15 seconds, and the doors will open to release you. Ethan smirked. I don't plan on stopping. Ralzek nodded, though a flicker of what seemed like genuine concern passed over his face. Very well. Then. The doors slid open with a deep, metallic groan, and Ethan stepped forward into the dark, unfamiliar depths of the Deathtrap maze. The initial corridor was dimly lit, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Ethan's steps echoed down the cold metallic floor as he advanced. The lights behind him dimmed, leaving him surrounded by darkness and a faint hum that seemed to pulse with the walls. He was aware that he had entered an area rich with radiation, designed to cripple or kill most biological organisms within minutes. His watch beeped softly, displaying escalating levels of radiation that would have sent any other species running for the exit. However, Ethan's body had been trained to withstand high doses. Years of Earth's harsh sun, along with his specialized training, had prepared him for situations like this. He adjusted his breathing, keeping it steady, focusing his thoughts on his training. The heat began to build, but Ethan pushed through, his mind blocking out the discomfort as he forced his body forward, step by calculated step. Meanwhile, in the observation room, Ralzek and the other scientists watched in awe as Ethan moved further into the radiation zone without hesitation. The data readings were astounding. Most creatures would have collapsed within the first few minutes, but the Deathworlder, this human, continued, undeterred. Dr. Isra, A younger scientist in the team whispered, "How is this possible?" His heart rate remained steady despite the intensity. Ralzek's gaze remained fixed on the screen, where Ethan's progress was mapped in real time. Humans are an enigma. We underestimated them. Ethan emerged from the radiation zone, his skin damp with sweat but otherwise unscathed. The next section loomed ahead, and a faint haze began to swirl in the corridor. His suit's sensors detected a rapidly rising level of toxicity, and an alert on his wrist panel warned him of the presence of a high-concentration nerve gas. The poison was crafted to be highly lethal, with neurotoxic properties that could cause immediate paralysis. He pulled a small filtration mask from his belt and secured it over his face, activating the built-in filter. As he moved forward, the gas thickened, swirling around him in ghostly plumes, but Ethan remained calm. The gas was designed to penetrate most organic defenses, but the combination of his mask and his own resistance allowed him to press on. The gas pricked at his eyes and his vision blurred momentarily, but he forced himself to focus, using mental conditioning techniques he had honed over years of training. His hands traced the wall as he moved forward, relying on touch to guide him when his vision wavered. Back in the observation room, several Z-Corps scientists murmured in astonishment. "No species has survived this section without assistance," one of them said, awe evident in their voice. Ralzek raised a hand to silence them. "He is adapting. It's as if his body was built to endure environments that should be fatal." As Ethan finally cleared the gas-filled corridor, he took a deep breath of filtered air and steadied himself, momentarily leaning against the wall. His muscles ached, his head throbbed, but he pushed it aside. There was still a long way to go, and he wasn't about to give the Z-Corps the satisfaction of seeing him fail. The next corridor was entirely different. Massive, bubbling pools of acidic liquid lined the floor, releasing a pungent, eye-watering smell. Each pool was bridged by narrow pathways, barely wide enough for a foot to balance on, and above him, a complex grid of metallic beams shimmered. His watch blinked again, warning him of sudden, random shifts in gravitational fields, a trap designed to disorient and throw intruders into the acid below. Ethan took a cautious step onto the first bridge, testing his balance. Suddenly, the gravity around him shifted, pulling him to one side. He countered with a quick adjustment, crouching low to keep his center of gravity stable. The maze's designers had clearly anticipated that any creature trying to pass would lose balance and tumble into the acid. Ethan's movements were precise as he balanced across the narrow beams, keeping his center low and distributing his weight. When gravity suddenly pulled to the left, he leaned right, his muscles tense as he adjusted to each unexpected shift. At one point, he nearly lost his footing as a blast of acidic mist sprayed up from one of the pools, narrowly missing his face. In the observation room, Dr. Ralzek leaned closer to the screen. "This shouldn't be possible. The gravitational shifts are randomized, no being could anticipate them with such accuracy." Yet there Ethan was, moving through each twist and turn as though he could feel the shifts before they happened. Step by step, he reached the end of the acid pool section, his breathing heavy but determined. As Ethan crossed yet another deadly section of the maze, the Z-Corps scientists exchanged looks of disbelief. They had studied humans extensively, or so they thought. But this was beyond any expectations. "What do you think, Dr. Ralzek?" Dr. Isra asked, barely able to contain her amazement. Ralzek stared at the screen, his eyes narrowing. "I think we are witnessing something beyond what our data could have predicted. Humans are not just survivors of a death world, they are creatures capable of adapting, of pushing beyond the limits of any known species." In the maze, Ethan continued, his steps steady, his gaze focused. He knew they were watching, analyzing every move he made, waiting for him to falter. But he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He was a Deathworlder, a product of one of the galaxy's most challenging planets, and he would see this challenge through to the end. As he neared the final part of the first chapter of the maze, Ethan's expression hardened. Whatever else lay ahead, he would face it and prove, once and for all, that humans were more than what the galaxy expected. They were stronger, smarter, and more resilient than any being could have anticipated. And the Z-Corps scientists, observing in stunned silence, were beginning to understand that humanity's potential went far deeper than they'd ever imagined. The air was thick and charged with an almost tangible tension as Captain Ethan Cross stepped beyond the last obstacle of the initial maze sections. His muscles ached from the strain, and a faint buzzing echoed in his ears from the high-pitched sonic traps he'd barely navigated. Every inch of his body was exhausted, but his mind remained sharp, honed by years of military training and survival conditioning. He knew that the Z-Corps scientists had underestimated him, and he was determined to show them just what a human could do. The corridor ahead was darker, the walls narrowing slightly as if to suffocate any who dared to proceed. He glanced at his wrist panel, which displayed minimal data about what lay beyond. This was uncharted territory, designed to be more lethal than anything he'd encountered before. Back in the observation room, Dr. Ralzek and his team huddled around monitors, each displaying live feeds from various sections of the maze. The alien scientists watched Ethan's every step, their gazes intense and captivated. For the first time, a participant had made it through the first half of the Deathtrap maze, and Ethan's survival raised more questions than answers. Dr. Isra leaned in close, her wide emerald eyes focused on the screens. "Ralzek," she whispered, unable to hide the awe in her voice. "No creature has made it this far. How is he still standing?" Ralzek, his normally stoic face a mask of intrigue and disbelief, kept his gaze fixed on the human. Humans possess an ability we've yet to fully understand. They are not only adaptable but seem capable of pushing themselves to the brink of physical destruction and surviving. Isra nodded, both impressed and concerned. What will he face next? Ralzek's voice was a murmur as he watched Ethan step further into the maze. The path he's about to enter is the most extreme yet. If he survives this, it will defy everything we know about biological limitations. The corridor opened up into a vast chamber, where the walls glowed with a faint blue light. Ethan's gaze swept across the room, his instincts alerting him to hidden dangers. He stepped cautiously, and within moments, a piercing sound filled the air. The sound waves intensified, vibrating through his bones, making his vision blur. These sonic blades were engineered to disorient and shatter any living being's focus, rendering them vulnerable. Ethan crouched low, grounding himself as best as he could, and adjusted his breathing, slowing his heart rate. His survival training had included intense audio tolerance exercises, but nothing like this. He gritted his teeth, keeping his eyes fixed forward, even as the sonic vibrations felt like needles stabbing his brain. He forced himself to focus, picking up the subtle rhythmic shifts in the waves. The sound was relentless, but he noticed it followed a pattern. His muscles tensed and relaxed in tune with each wave, allowing him to sync his body with the frequency, using it to maintain his balance. Step by step, he edged forward, letting the rhythm guide him through the chamber. In the observation room, the Z-Corps scientists watched in stunned silence as Ethan navigated the sonic blade section with a precision that baffled them. Dr. Ralzek leaned forward, eyes wide with fascination. "Remarkable," he murmured. "He's adapting his movements to the rhythm. No other species has thought to use the frequency patterns for navigation." One scientist muttered, "If this human gets through the next phase, we may have to rewrite our understanding of organic resilience." Ralzek nodded. "It appears we underestimated Deathworlders on a fundamental level." The sonic blades had drained Ethan, but there was no time to rest. The next section led him into a narrow corridor that radiated intense heat. Ethan could feel the temperature climbing as he moved forward, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Just as he adjusted to the scorching heat, the temperature plummeted, and the walls began to frost over, turning the corridor into a frozen hellscape. The sudden shifts were violent and relentless, engineered to induce hypothermia and heatstroke within seconds. Ethan's mind raced. His suit could provide basic temperature regulation, but the extreme fluctuations were testing its limits. His breath condensed into visible clouds, then evaporated as the temperature swung wildly. He slowed his pace, breathing in rhythm, allowing his body a moment to adjust to each change. He moved forward, the frozen walls biting at his exposed skin, then seconds later, scalding waves of heat singeing his suit. Ethan felt his body straining under the pressure, but his focus remained unwavering. He pressed on, blocking out the searing heat and numbing cold, one step at a time. In the observation room, a scientist murmured in disbelief. He should be on the verge of collapse. But Ralzek shook his head. He's moving strategically. He's pacing himself through the shifts. It's as if he's training his body in real time to withstand each change. As Ethan finally cleared the corridor, the Z-Corps scientists exchanged uneasy glances. This human, this Deathworlder, was doing the impossible. The path ahead led into a chamber lined with shimmering metal plates that hummed with energy. Ethan's suit sensors warned him of massive shifts in gravitational fields as he stepped forward, but he'd come too far to stop. The gravity in this room shifted constantly, swinging between intense pulls and near weightlessness, intended to throw intruders off balance and make movement impossible. To make matters worse, powerful magnetic fields pulsed from the walls, interfering with his equipment and disorienting his movements. Ethan staggered, the sudden changes in gravity throwing off his equilibrium. He gripped the wall, grounding himself against the overwhelming pull, only to be lifted into near-zero gravity the next second. Adjusting, he began to use the shifting gravity to his advantage, timing his steps with each gravitational pull. When the field surged, he braced himself. When it lightened, he pushed forward with careful precision. His movements were deliberate, calculated, as he used the magnetic fields to propel himself through the chamber. Back in the observation room, the scientists were in awe of his strategy. He's using the shifts to conserve energy, moving only when gravity is at its lowest, Ezra remarked. How could he even know how to adapt this way? Ralzek observed quietly. Humans, they are not bound by conventional thinking. They seem to adapt instinctively to situations that should be fatal. Ethan's progress was slow but steady, and as he cleared the final magnetic pulse, he staggered forward, breathing heavily, his face damp with sweat but his expression resolute. Ethan had reached what he hoped was the last section of the maze. The room ahead was filled with a dense, shifting cloud that moved like a living entity, faintly shimmering with an eerie, greenish glow. His sensors identified it as a biohazardous compound, a viral cloud designed to infiltrate and destroy biological matter at the cellular level. He pulled his filtration mask tighter and took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself. This was the ultimate test, designed to break down any organic being. His eyes narrowed as he stepped into the cloud, feeling the sting of the viral particles against his skin. The cloud began to eat through his suit, microscopic tears forming as the compound attempted to penetrate his defenses. Ethan felt a burn on his skin, but he gritted his teeth, his mind fighting against the instinct to recoil. His training had taught him to endure, to push through pain. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, ignoring the searing agony as he forced his way forward. Back in the observation room, Ralzek and his team watched with bated breath. The biohazardous cloud was their final test, the trap that had stopped every creature before him. But Ethan continued, his movements slow but relentless. He's actually making it through, one scientist whispered, barely able to comprehend what they were witnessing. Ezra looked at Ralzek, her eyes wide with shock. If he survives this, we'll need to revise our entire biological model. As Ethan pushed forward, he felt his body begin to numb, his vision fading slightly at the edges. But he had one thought that drove him forward: he would prove that humans, the Deathworlders, could endure anything. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged from the cloud, his suit in tatters, his skin raw and burning. But he was alive. He had survived. Ethan's final steps through the Deathtrap maze were greeted by silence in the observation room. The Z-Corps scientists could only stare at the screens, disbelief etched across their faces. No creature, no being they had ever studied, had endured such trials. And yet this human had walked through every trap, every deadly test, and emerged victorious. Dr. Ralzek's voice was barely above a whisper as he finally spoke. "We have underestimated humanity, their resilience, their adaptability. It goes beyond our comprehension." Wazra nodded, her expression one of respect. Deathworlders indeed. They are the living embodiment of survival against all odds. As Ethan staggered into the decontamination chamber, his mind raced with exhaustion and triumph. He knew that he had left a mark here, not just as a human, but as a representative of a species that was stronger and more adaptable than any in the galaxy had realized. For the Z-Corps, it was a humbling experience, a realization that they were not as advanced as they had believed. There were still mysteries in the universe, and humanity was one of them. As Ethan leaned back, finally allowing himself to catch his breath, he smiled to himself. He had not only survived the Deathtrap maze, but he had also redefined what it meant to be a Deathworlder. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the observation room, he knew that the Z-Corps scientists would never look at humans the same way again.